We're at the
Welcome
very,
to
very
Uncommon
early
Knowledge.
stage of the
The
intelligence
end
big bang.
times,
Being a
Armageddon,
multi-planet species
the
greatly
Antichrist.
increases the probable
If you
lifespan
suppose
of
the only people who take those
civilization, or
concepts
consciousness
seriously
and intelligence,
snake
both
handlers in the
biological
hollers
and
of Kentucky,
digital. I think we're
think
quite
again.
close to digital
Peter
superintelligence.
Thiel
If it doesn't
on
happen this year,
Uncommon
next year
Knowledge
for sure.
now.
Please give it up for Elon Musk.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robbins. Peter Thiel earned his undergraduate and law degrees here at Stanford. He was the
Elon,
co-founder of PayPal,
welcome
the
to
firm that
AI
all but
Startup
invented
School. We're just
fintech.
really blessed
The
to have
first
your presence
outside
here today.
investor in Facebook, the firm that all but invented
So-
social networks, and a co-founder of Palantir,
SpaceX,
the
Tesla,
firm that all
Neuralink,
but invented
xAI,
defense tech.
and more. Was
Although
there
he's
ever a
staying out of
moment in your
politics,
life
this year
before
Mr.
all
Thiel
this
has
where
had
you
a
felt,
hand in launching
I
the
have
careers
to
of a
build
number of
something
political
great?
figures,
And what flipped
including
that switch?
J.D. Vance.
Well, I
Mr.
didn't
Thiel
originally
speaks
think I would
often on
build something
philosophy,
great.
religion, tech,
I
and
wanted to try to
society.
build
He
something
informs as diverse
useful,
as the Cambridge Union,
but I didn't think
the
I would
Aspen
build
Ideas
anything
Festival, and
particularly
the
great.
Joe
If you said
Rogan
probabilistically,
Experience.
seemed unlikely.
You gave Joe Rogan
But I
3
wanted to at
hours.
least try.
Peter, it's about
So you're
time you
talking
came back to
to
this
a
trial.
room full of people
three
who are all
hours there.
technical engineers.
Peter
often,
Thiel
some
on
of
the
most
end
eminent
times.
AI researchers
Today, by the
coming
way,
up
this
with
is
that.
going to be episode 1 of 2, our first conversation on this very large topic. Peter, 2 quotations.
I like the term engineer better than
Matthew
researcher.
24,
I mean, I
35,
suppose if there's some
36.
fundamental
Quote, heaven and earth will pass away,
algorithmic breakthrough,
but of that
A lot of
day
my
and
friends at
hour
OpenAI
no
is,
one knows,
research, otherwise
not
it's
even
very
the angels of
kids.
heaven.
Let's start
Close
way
quote.
back.
I
I
think
mean,
everyone I
when
know
you
Peter
were,
Thiel.
is very
this is a room
optimistic.
full
We
of
don't know the
15
day and the
to
hour.
25
Maybe we
year
can
olds.
guess the
It
century.
skews younger.
Explain
because
yourself.
Founder set is
But
younger
also,
and younger.
they were
Well,
A way to set them back.
Can you
there.
put yourself
I
back
mean,
into their
you know,
shoes?
they will
This,
grow up
this
like,
is a very
You were
broad
18
topic.
and
It's,
19,
it's
learning
larger
the code,
question about
even coming up with the
the
first
extraordinary
idea for
history of our
Zip2.
time.
What was that like for you?
Yeah, back in '95,
obviously
The
I
modern world
lot.
I was faced with a choice of either do
But I think
Renaissance
much
mode
more about the like
you know,
has been
grad
this
studies
world
PhD at
of
Stanford,
ever progressing
in material
scientific
science,
and
actually working on
technological
ultra
development.
capacitors for
They're,
potential use in electric
like, and
vehicles,
I'll-
essentially
and
trying to
there's
solve
this
the
very
range problem
profound
for
I don't
electric
think my
vehicles.
kids will ever be
uh,
involved
or-
in
There are things that
uh,
change
smarter
the
than AI.
dimensions of
Yeah.
Just like
try to do
technology,
something in this
military
thing that most people
technology,
never heard of,
communications
internet.
technology,
And
where
baby or
things are
I
not
talked to my
timeless and
professor, who was
eternal. They're sort of
Bill Nix,
with
in the
one of
material
those
science
the
old
department,
gunpowder
and
revolution
said,
in the
going
17th
like this on the
century.
screen.
can I
And
defer
that
for a
changed
quarter?
the social structure
because
and the
this
political
will
structure.
probably fail,
Kids born now.
and then I'll
there is a
come
certain
back to
arc to
college.
history. It's not just
And,
technology,
And
And
but
then he said, this is probably the last
it is
conversation we'll have.
it is a driver.
and
he
they
was
will
right.
look back at
And,
this as
and
like, okay,
certainly,
So,
and again,
but
many
those
different ways
things
of getting
most
this, but
likely fail. Not
I
there
saw
certainly
something
are
on social
dimensions
media
of-
where a guy talked about
of
he
the
got tired of
technology
talking to
that
his
have
kid about Thomas
become
the Tank
extremely
Engine.
powerful
And then
So he put it
in
into
the last
ChatGPT in voice
century or
mode.
two.
kids
that
love
have
voice
an
basically-
apocalyptic
Yeah, he's like an hour
dimension.
later, the
think.
kid's still
And,
talking
close to
about
the
And
first,
perhaps it's
maps,
it's strange
directions.
not
Again,
to
I
try
suspect
to
they're
relate it
white
to
pages
not
the
all
biblical
pages, they're
tradition.
one
You know, it's a, if
Yeah.
these
you know,
sort
I just
nuclear
wrote
weapons
that
can rain
question.
down
I
fire
didn't
and
even use web
brimstone,
server. I just
destroy
wrote
the
directly.
world.
society have to
And then
figure
we
out
have
guardrails
a,
and
you know, we have
Can
a
afford,
biblical
and I couldn't
tradition.
but the upside's
Maybe it
more
doesn't say that
expensive,
this
and
is
we-
inevitably going to
society
happen,
in
but
general.
something
Originally
like
split
this
it
might
was
well
on
happen
Sherman
if
Avenue,
humans are
Palo Alto.
left to their own
There was
devices.
like
Yeah,
an
I'm
ISP
optimistic.
at least be
We're
asking
seeing some
questions.
interesting
So I
data
could look
where
at the
figure out
so
ways for these
used
things to
along
inform one
in
another.
classrooms
So,
with a good teacher.
Obviously, we're coming to a
ChatGPT
moment of
comes
the
very good,
analyses,
used
to the
solely by
signs of the
itself,
end
sort
time.
of like homework crutch.
But first, a
My
moment
brother
on
joined
why
me
sort of
and
just doing the
another
same thing as
co-founder,
you're
Greg
asking
Reed,
these
passed away,
questions. And as
I was
I
one of those
understand
kids
your
that
argument,
everyone
Peter,
was worried I was just
we
gonna
you
at the
feel
time we couldn't even afford a
stop learning.
place
you
to
need to
stay,
ask
so we just
and to
the
prompt a
office was
conversation,
$500 a month.
at
We
least
slept
in
the
part,
office and
because
and then
So-
showered at the
universities-
YMCA
Think
on
of what you
Facebook,
could
well,
become
you
if you didn't Google
which is
know.
odd in some ways. The
So we've
biblical
seen this
framework,
adoption figures.
these
which are
texts
really
may be 2,000
insane.
years
Yeah,
old,
I
but
guess
they've
I ended up
informed
doing
popular product.
Western
a
civilization
little
and
bit
taken
of
up the time of
research on
scholars
ChatGPT.
through these
ChatGPT
centuries.
thing
It
from
has
the
been
beginning. So in some sense,
an
no, but will it
understanding
still
in
be
Western
called to it?
culture,
We did
Western
build a lot
culture
of,
at least,
Okay.
that history is
So the
going
really
someplace.
So the other thing
good
we hear
And
is
if there is an
AGI,
entry, no matter how
which-
far off in the future it may be, we're closer
I'd
to
like
it
to
now
hear
than
some
we
more
were,
definition
than
of
by
AGI.
the-
we were 2000.
In many
All right,
senses,
so
companies
you
in that
ask
all of these
for
seem
a
to me
long time,
plausible,
the host and
valid,
whatnot were
and
investors
serious
and
questions.
pose
Why
a
can't?
definition
Why
of
don't
AI, and
universities?
also on the
Why
board.
are universities
So
ill-equipped to
they
grapple
kept
with
just
this?
wanting to use
Well,
software
that's
in ways that
very
made no sense.
overdetermined, but
I think
but
the
certainly
definition,
I wanted to go
anything that
directly
you know,
into that.
is
Anyways,
now
long
if the-
story,
there's some
selling
relation
too much
between the
into it, but
university and the universe.
I really just wanted to do something useful on the
You're
internet.
and
it is supposed to
keep
somehow,
getting smarter.
in
I
its
guess
ideal
choices,
form,
like,
in its
more
early
do
modern
a PhD and watch
17th,
people build the
18th
internet,
century
every
or
year.
the university
helpful
was
in a
supposed
simple
to
way.
represent some kind of
And I was like,
integration
well,
of
I guess I
knowledge
can always
across
try
a
and
lot
fail
of
and then go
disciplines,
back to UBS studies.
where they
You know, we have
all
systems now
fit
that
together.
It ended up being
For
reasonably
you know,
successful.
a variety of
that are
reasons
sold
one
for
can
like
cite,
$200 million,
this
which
has
was a lot at the
broken
time.
down
Like,
over
well,
time.
these
There
days
are
that's like
ideological
maybe a better
reasons,
question
minimum
is-
but maybe there
impulse
also are
from AI
practical
startup was
reasons
something I would
$6
because
consider
the amount of knowledge
intelligence.
became
Okay.
too great
It's
like,
for any single
If
person
we had a
to
system
master.
so many
that's
friggin'
And then you
unicorns,
had
it's like
ever
capable
division
of
of
either
just ever
doing
narrower
$1
autonomous
subdisciplines.
discovery of
You
new
know, Adam
science,
Smith
or
has
There's
this
been inflation
metaphor in the
since,
19th century of
quite a bit more money on
Manufacturing
manufacturing
Yeah, I mean,
companies,
like
there are 100
90
people
Nine
that
to
would
five
feel like
factoring
kind
all
of
doing
almost
different
every
things, and
single
nobody
Well,
knows how to
likewise,
make a
but I
pin
mean,
in
yeah.
it. So
Yeah,
it's
there's
this,
been a lot of
it's
inflation.
efficient, but it's
So
this hyper
basically, a
specialization.
lot of it's
I
kind of
mean,
this
the
gradient
highest
where
probably
getting
been
better and better.
an
and
analog
oh,
to
this
that
feels- I felt like that
on
way
the
when we had
university
the
side
GPT-4
where
internally
maybe-
playing
maybe,
this. I'm like,
maybe someone like
that
there's
you
are-
10
could
years
still
of running.
understand
So
less
something
than
about
a year old,
everything.
getting
when it starts
Hilbert,
using
a
itself,
great mathematician
$1
around
billion
1900
valuations.
could
when you're
still
saying it comes
understand
out
all
with
of
somebody
math. And
theoretical
I guess could-
proof,
25
pan out,
problems
and
for
then, oh,
the
hey, we found
20th
a better
century
case
for
for
math
cancer, or
mathematicians
found
to
out
solve
about
and some
the
ways
lazy drug or
set the agenda.
It
Yeah, I
is
mean, I
boring
am a
to see some
big
mathematics
believer that
and,
the harder
and
bit
even
of
as rigorous
what do you
a
think?
subject area as
people's lives
mathematics,
is
in some
more
ways has
scientific
devolved
progress.
to
Mhm.
something
That is
close
kind
to
of-
literary.
I'm pretty
That is
bullish.
very much what
I'm,
the
full, I'm pretty
Yeah.
bullish,
So
honestly.
he's
So
doing.
I think the people in this
And,
room are going to create
it's sort of
a
these
lot of the
very
value.
incommensurate
You know,
modes
a
of
billion
discourse
people in the
and
world
very
should be
anything that
using
has
this
to do
stuff.
with
And
making
And
sense
we're
of
not
the
even
larger whole
scratching the
has,
surface of it.
has gotten
I love the
badly
internet
lost.
story in that
Responses of
And
uh, even back
I've
then,
thought
you know,
for a long time,
you
really
are a
need
lot
to
like the
ask a
people in
variety
this
of
Have
room
you
questions.
back
seen,
then.
like,
about the
segmented
larger
this, you'd
whole,
say
you
internally?
know,
Have you
one
seen
kind
things
of
The
like,
heads
scientific
of
and
all
technological
the
question
CEOs of all the
simply,
legacy media
are we
companies
still
look to
progressive
you
as we
as the
were
person
in
who
the
invented the
30s?
internet.
Are things,
And
by
a lot
whatever
of the
metric you
world,
choose, are
you know,
they
the
getting
corporate
better?
world,
Life
like the world at large that does not understand what's happening in
maybe
AI,
increase
they're going to look to
quality
people
of
in this
life by
room
various metrics.
for exactly
Are-
that. It sounds like,
are we going
you know, what are some of the
faster?
tangible
People
lessons? It
using
sounds like one of them
planes
is
or supersonic
don't give up
planes or
board
space
control,
planes
or be
or
careful about
researchers
have a really good
and,
lawyer.
Like that is a
and
sort of
that seems like a very a
it's
very
obviously not
basic
startup,
kind of
the big
macroeconomic
science,
question.
but
The
it is
really
definitely
incredibly
mistake
hard
was
to ask,
having too
but,
much
faster.
shareholder
surely
involvement
important
from
one.
from
And
legacy
then
media
and then
companies
you know there are
who then
there-
So,
and I've
I
spoken about
wouldn't
so many
necessarily
other
figure things
contexts,
through
but
the
my,
lens
my
of
intuition
just like,
legacy
is
media
that in
and,
many places there's
that
been
on its own.
they'll kinda
relative
make you do
stagnation,
things
We're getting
the
good
hyper
sensible
specialization,
rate
but
of progress is
really don't make sense
disguises a
with
certain
the new
type of
technology.
decadence where you have these narrow
super
experts
I should point out
saying
that
how wonderful
that
they
I,
are, the
watching-
cancer
I
cell,
didn't
cancer
actually
cell.
at first
Cancer
from a
researchers say they're going to cure
I
cancer in the
tried to
next
get a job
5
in
years,
Netscape.
and extreme people say they're the
I sent my
smartest
resume
physicists
to
and they know
Netscape.
everything.
And Mark
But
Andreessen knows about
maybe it's
this.
just some weird
and,
academic
reminder,
power
but I
game
think
where
it
they're
was
blocking
resume,
everybody
and
else.
then nobody responded.
And on and on.
then
And so,
hanging out in the lobby
so there
of
is a,
Netscape,
so there is,
I
you know,
noticed,
bump into some
even before we get
people
to the
that
big
just
question of
started
history,
the
there's
model
the
in
question
Amazon
just
203.
of,
Yeah.
you know,
I noticed a
So
big
I'll
the
just
history
way
of
better.
science and
See how it goes.
technology.
So it wasn't actually
progressed
me
a
being
lot.
like,
I'd say
I
that
wanna
the
start
thing
something,
that
I
we
wanna
ran
be
into
more
part of
slowly.
was
Why has that
you know, the
changed?
internet.
is that you
What's
have
going
people
on
who
there?
promise
In some way.
agentic
You said-
systems
so-
that can do all these things,
and
but
so
the moment you get a
Fragmentation,
job problem,
hyperspecialization in the
I have to start
university,
again.
the feeling
Falls
of kind of
Interestingly,
disintegration
anyway,
into
the-
silos.
Yeah, I mean, from an
That's one
a
aspect
lot
of
of
it.
AI
Another
will
aspect
so
of it,
told
profoundly
me that
change
their
the
crucial
future.
moment
I'm
was
checking this, and this is the form of the
Operator.
question.
Three.
Uh,
And
is
there's
whether-
something about watching an AI use a
Extreme
computer
rationalism
not perfectly, but it's
maybe
yeah.
emerges
I mean,
from that
assuming we don't
specialization, or
support
maybe informs
things
it.
don't
But
go
I've heard you
wrong,
say,
like
I've got a
AI
quotation here from you,
doesn't
It
kill
is
us
under the
in itself.
rationalist
to the same
view,
degree, although it's quite
you
impressive.
can't even talk about the
Yeah,
end of your
I
own
ultimately-
life, let alone the
Mine
end
was
of
with
the
Duke
world.
research because
that
I felt like a
is-
really
There's
agentic
something
use of it.
about
And
the
that was when I
regnant
came
10
back
times
and
more than
produced
view.
something
I'm
on
trying to
autonomous
resist the word
vehicles that
ideology.
was better than I've read before.
or whatever.
Ideology isn't
Because
quite the right.
previously all those models
Machine
would just
descendants
get a
or
bunch of
class-
sources,
mostly
The way the
summarize
university
it.
conducts
But
its
when I watched the
become
system
like
go
a
out on the internet,
Kardashev scale
get
two
data,
rules out
situation.
questions
follow
life,
that,
death,
then follow
sin,
that
redemption,
lead,
and
then
meaning
follow
of
back,
history.
and come
And
back.
yet those are the
Like
so
like
what,
I was
what I'm trying to get at
for
is
thousands of
special
times.
hyper specialization.
Millions
Yes,
of times.
is there also something else, something about the sheer,
the autodidact,
the regnant view
and knows about everything.
that makes it very hard for
And-
Yeah, I mean,
universities to grapple with?
he-
I did
uses
sort of feel a
deep
bit like,
research to
when
Big
IPCC is
question.
taking a lot of flags about
Uh,
getting
and
rid
then
of
just sits
waste
there
and
all
forward,
day.
which was an
and
interesting
Yes,
side quest.
they seem hard to
Um,
grapple
yeah,
with
side
it.
quest, yeah.
Why is probably
and it
harder
is
to
like,
say.
It
I
is
gotta
an
get back to the
Certainly,
main
if
quest.
we do something like
Yeah, I gotta get
the
back to the main
radical
quest here.
life extension project,
So
I
back
built
to
my
the
own
main
app
quest,
that literally
people in
lets me ask
17th,
questions and it
18th
generates
centuries
audio
were
files
very
for
but I
this
just
stuff
think,
because
you
it's
know,
just
a
like
little bit
that.
like
I'm
Benjamin
like,
Franklin.
curiosity
it's like
probably
fixing
exceeds
the
my
government is
retention.
kind of like
Francis
this, like
Bacon.
say,
In Operator, I'll
to
do
all
a magical
these
moment like
ideas
some
of
PC
these
with an
extensions
XGO
like
next to it,
like
Marshall
trash,
McLuhan, and I
by
wanted to get a bunch of
by
images of
centuries.
Marshall
But then
McLuhan,
there's
and I asked him
also
to do
this
it,
like
and then all of a
as
sudden,
late
I had a
as
whole
the
folder,
late
which is a
19th,
full
early
of
20th century, there's a
AI,
movie
which
called
was
Cosmism.
and
for
So
a research thing would have taken me forever to
the time of
do.
the Soviet
Yeah, I
Revolution,
think we're just gonna be
1920s
in
in Soviet
this
Union.
where
not that
whatever
much.
we
It,
thought about
it claimed that
words
for
Although,
the
We're glad
revolution
you're back on the main
succeed,
quest. It's very important.
you had to
back
physically
to main
resurrect
quest,
all the dead
Yeah.
people
How are
using
you-
technology,
science.
which
And
is,
the workers of the
Yeah.
world
what I
unite
like doing.
science
and
that I'm
to
so
forget
curious
with the
about.
times.
It's just so
Their
much
slogan
noise.
is dead of
Just
the world
the noise
unites.
ratio.
And then,
Politics
of course,
is
they didn't make
terrible.
much progress
So,
on
I had
this,
more
and then at
time.
some point, by the time you get to
I mean, I live in
Stalin,
San
the show
Francisco,
trials,
Like, I
so
would
you don't need to
death
tell me
seems to be going up,
twice.
not
Yeah,
down.
DC,
But
like,
But
yeah,
there was a moment when
I
they
guess
thought
it's
it might
a
even be
little
possible.
there was
Yeah.
an
What's
incredible
neat is the sharing
ambition,
feature, which
incredible
I find
energy
is
to
if you share
modern
with somebody else,
science.
PDFs are
or
great.
It was
cars,
perhaps
and that's
downstream
have
from
software
I would say that
Christianity.
even though
runs
if,
reliably.
if the
we have
problem
deep
with
research, we have
Christianity
these
is physical
tools,
resurrection,
there is a
then
model
science
and so the
had
question
to,
comes up is
could
like
offer that too as a
GPT-5.
possibility.
And the idea is
There's
that
a
like
rival
math
to
systems like that
Christianity.
are
rigorous
rigorous
You know,
judgments.
you
abilities.
don't need
What is the
Christianity
time
to
between
break
like
science.
GPT-5? When are we
Um,
going to see this?
And then,
environment,
and then there is
sometimes
a
knowledge,
strange
right?
way
I don't know
that the
exactly
project
I'm good.
in many
When
dimensions
did we go back and
feels
forth on this?
very
How much is
exhausted,
supposed to,
even
like,
though of
I guess
course
I'm
not
kind
still
of curious,
genuine
going back to the
science,
Zipsky
but
moment,
even science
you
can
had
capital
hundreds
S,
of
what we
millions
did
of
with
dollars, or you
GDP
had an
emissions
exit
has
that
been
worth
better.
hundreds of millions of
I
dollars.
mean,
We
I-
don't
I-
do it now.
what do you mean?
If you
Right.
I had to handle the research.
Okay,
if
so you
were
solved the money
individual
problem, at
scientists,
least.
And meanwhile, I had to kind of
it's
do
sort
this
of-
you
test off.
basically
it's much
took it
less
and
than
you
sort of
rolled, you
and
kept
3.5
rolling
kept
heroic,
getting better
um,
and better and
you know,
better.
Yeah.
bold
And the
figure
comparisons I was able to make
breaks with
with changes.
dogmas.
Yes.
If that's my
I
question,
kept
so
the
yeah,
chips on the
like,
table.
would I know
Yeah.
GPT-5
It's much
versus
more,
So,
you know,
Not everyone does
you're-
that.
you're-
A lot of the
4.5.
people in this
You're just
room
a
will have to
probably
make that
not-
decision,
not
actually.
necessarily.
What
I mean,
drove
in
you
like
to
in
smaller
become
music,
car
right?
involved
than
in
every
this?
bigger
Like
machine or
peak
something
iteration,
like this.
4.5 or
Well, I
something,
think
you
I
call it
felt
5.
for with Zip 2,
it
we
used
built,
to
like,
be
incredible
this
technology,
notion
which we were really
of
good at
train
use.
the
Um,
end of
put it out,
times
and then we
Right.
train
I
the
think
big model and put it
in
out.
the
at
biblical
least from my
framework.
You know,
perspective,
now
Rene
we had
that
better
Girard.
technology
Rene
than,
Girard,
say,
an important figure
Yahoo or
here,
anyone else,
Post-train
but it
make
was
them better.
professor of
I-
French literature
We're
here
thinking
at
about this
Stanford,
right now.
So I wanted
but
to do
also
something
every
a
time we're-
theologian.
so we
I
launched
think it's
something
fair to
new,
call him a
big screen
theologian.
document, and nobody
and
actually
philosopher,
did an updated
wrote
version
very,
of
very
X1,
widely,
which is
although that was
right.
outside his Stanford.
PayPal,
Or should we call it
essentially
5.1,
X.com
5.2?
We
merging
became
with
friends with
370,
him.
which,
It happens that he was a neighbor of
created
mine. We both knew
PayPal, and
Rene.
I don't
All
think
right,
we have
Rene
that.
Girard
that
in
actually led to
2009.
some PayPal diaspora.
Few still
But I think
talk
there
about
is
the
something better to
apocalypse.
do than
It
the
might
way
have
we
created
handle
The
it before.
apocalypse, of course, is the word referring to the destruction of the world
People
as described in the
anything
book of
in the 21st
Revelation.
century.
Rene, few still talk about the
so many
apocalypse,
talented people were at
and they
the
usually have a
gotta figure
completely
something out.
mythological
Yeah, that's
conception of it.
the challenge.
Strangely,
is,
they do
So I
not
just
see
wanted to
even
that
if
the
you're
violence
technically
we
blind,
ourselves are in the
kinda gotta
process
kind
of
of understand,
amassing
okay, if there's an O
and that is
before it,
looming
like
over
this,
our
but if I
own
want
heads
it, you know, like,
is
but
entirely
then even then it's
sufficient
not clear.
to
Should I
trigger
use
the worst.
O
Close
harmony?
quote.
Should I use O?
So there we
harmony?
come
Should
to
I
the
use
first
this?
question about how you
I think
understand
this
these
is like an
things.
example
The
of
apocalypse
this was an artifact
as
of
presented in the
paradox.
biblical framework
as
as
And then we
symbols
kinda
of
had
spiritual
going on.
realities,
I think
or
these
the
are
apocalypse as a plain
near the
prediction
end
about
current
how the
life.
world
I can
could
imagine
or
a
indeed
world, I don't know
will
what it
end.
is, but I
This
can
check
imagine a world
arrives
where we
in the
discover
mail.
some new
Of
paradigm
all places.
that
Yeah,
again means
it's,
we have to like
and then
bifurcate
the
the
number
let's see,
of my bank
it is,
more complicated names.
I hope we don't have
the,
to. I am
the way
excited to
Gerard
just get
would have put it,
Yeah.
the way I
so
came to see it as well was that in
It's
some
easier for
sense,
people.
then I ended
the
up putting,
apocalyptic
you
prophecies
almost all
are
that into,
just a
X1
prediction
Harmony,
of what
as we
humans
said,
are
right,
likely to do
keeping
Before many
almost
high
in a
all
world
the
which
tools
they
on the
have
table.
ever
Yeah,
more
we'll have a
powerful
conversation until 3.
technologies.
I think
And,
we will
which
meet
there are no sacred limits
out of
Yeah, and
on,
then
on
after-
these, these technologies.
PayPal
Well,
Yeah,
human
it's
nature
it's fun
has
to
not-
have
I was really
choice.
curious
right
as to
now.
why
There's-
we had
it's
not
not
sent
gotten
anyone
better.
to Mars.
And,
I think one of the
And I
things
went on
that's
the-
and
went on
it
the
has
NASA
this sort of
website
made
to
these
find
things
out
more
where I was
capable,
sending
but
people
also
limitless,
hard to
and there
understand
was
where
no
the
violence
capability is
aspect,
coming from.
maybe
These
I
integrations
hard
things
to
like
aspect
memory
to
on
it.
the
and
website.
memory
it's,
started
um,
off
but
is
in
one
fact,
very
and I
simple
think
thing.
Gerard
that
had all
goes
these
more
sort of
sophisticated
provocative
Mars.
formulations.
Memory
like
is-
it is.
So then,
It is just a
I've got-
scientific
This
prediction
is such a long
of what
story, so I don't want to
humanity is
take up too
likely
much
to
time
do.
here. But
you know, the
in a
first time
world
we-
of
I think
ever
we're all
more
listening with
powerful,
rapt attention.
ever more
So
powerful
I was actually
technology.
that
I was on the
felt
Long Island
and
Expressway
then,
with my
there
friend
sort of
Dale
are
Resi.
and
We
now
were
all
they're
these
like,
different things when
I
we see
feel
things
like
like
there's like
biblical
knows a lot
and
more
Dale was asking me
apocalyptic
what we're
accounts,
going
but
to do. What am I
Gerard
going
is
to do
ask it
after
very
PayPal? And I was like,
skeptical of
like, I don't know.
the
I guess
idea that
maybe I'd
somehow
like to
the
do something
violence came from
philanthropic in
God.
space because I
He
didn't think
always
I could
thought
actually
that,
do anything
you know,
emotional in
atheists
space
and
because that seemed like the
fundamentalists
purview of nature.
disagree on the
some
secondary
I didn't think of.
and relatively
that
not
has
so
been
But, you know,
important
I'm
question
kinda
of
curious
whether or
as to
not
when
God
we're
exists.
going to send
So I
people to
and
Mars.
I hear that
And
from a lot
they
of
agree
that's when I was like,
There are
oh,
people
it's
who
not
don't
on the
like
far
website.
more
And then I
important
started
question.
digging
that
I-
one of
There's nothing on the
I think we're
God's
heading towards
attributes is violence.
The
And
AI
so
will
the
just have
violence
and,
comes from God.
on
This
their
is-
life.
And I'm
this is
definitely
the new
summarizing a lot
atheist
here.
In the
but,
evangelical view,
um,
the destruction of
which
the world
I-
is
for
God
me, it's cool
exercising
at the back of
justice
the
over
office
the
also.
world.
my first
It
idea
is,
was to
But one of the
yeah,
challenges
it's
right
like-
now
it's
was
some
in
version of
New York Times'
justice.
ongoing
where,
lawsuit with
anger,
OpenAI.
wrath.
They
Some-
just
some
asked the
version
court
of
to tell
anger,
OpenAI
wrath
they
of
had to
God,
preserve
dehydrated
consumer
and then,
ChatGPT user records
and then,
beyond the
You know,
30-day window.
atheist one's a little bit
that has to be
stranger
public
because you
record
don't really
recently.
believe God
And,
exists,
great,
but
Brad Lightcap
money
but
shot
still,
with
letter
it's,
responding to
green
this.
clamps on a
it
red
is,
background.
We're gonna fight that
it's,
obviously, and I
it is
suspect
somehow
For the longest time, by the way, I didn't realize
it's
money
not
shot. I think is a
humanity.
porn
Humanity,
reference.
you know,
I think it was
is
crazy.
is,
But
is,
anyway,
is
the
not
point
that
is that
dangerous,
that
at
would be
least
the
in,
great
in
shot
sort
of
of
green
the
plants on a red
mainstream,
background.
you know,
to
Lockean
try to
and Rousseau
inspire,
accounts.
So
Um,
you've made
NASA
the
and
point,
public
but
to-
I must admit
to
I'd
stand up
forgotten
for
this.
this, to
You've made the
talk.
point that Renee
As I learned more,
look for
I
the
used to
silver
observe
lining here. I hope this is
that the
along
church,
way,
the
by the way,
Catholic
I
Church,
went to
in its
Russia
liturgy and in
in like
homilies,
2001 and
used
2002
to make quite a lot of the
by
end
ICBMs.
times
core principle of
and
using
warn
AI.
people to
like,
prepare
that's
for
what cannot
judgment and
happen.
so
You know, you
forth.
go and meet with Russian
Up until
men, say, "I'd like you
1945,
guys an ICBM."
when the church
This
seems
is
to have
the
decided to
space.
go easier on
Yeah,
that
yeah,
because
rocket.
people
Not
needed
to
comfort
nuke anyone, but
more
think
than
society needs that.
exhortation
I think
about the
they
end
had,
times.
they had to,
Unfortunate.
Obvious
as a
point.
result
That
of arms reduction talks,
What
they
happened
had
in
to actually
1945?
destroy a bunch
This
of their,
So we got
their base
nuclear
Cuban
weapons,
missiles.
and the
that
stuff
society needs to
became
have
So I was
about
like,
how
well,
real in
how
a
much if
way
we
that
take two of those,
privacy and
minus
AI
the
seemed
nuke,
the answer
completely
add an
implausible
additional,
in the 17th and
few
18th
states
century. I
from
mean, when
Mars.
people were writing about these
But
things
it
in the
was
18th,
kind of
even 19th
trippy,
century,
you know, being
Now,
in
it was-
Moscow
ChatGPT
in
will be a very
or
the
2001
idea that
negotiating with
the world was just too
the
big a
Russian
place, it could
military
not
by
possibly
ICBMs.
be
So
destroyed.
that
Like,
brings
that's
up the
crazy.
other question
God
from
would do it, and no one
using
believed
this
that God was
skepticalism.
so violent that God
OpenAI
would
now
do it.
has
But they
access
kept
to this
also
data,
existed,
and there is
and
the
then,
concern
you
one
know,
was
the
about
technology
saying
was
which
getting
like,
more
it was
powerful,
very clear
but,
when
the
or when
opposite
not
of
it's
what
training,
negotiations
the option
it
to
should
turn
didn't
it off.
do.
quite
The other
seem
thing is
possible
like
things that getting really
advertising
expensive.
things like that.
And then I
worldwide
came to
scale.
realize that actually the
How are
problem
you
was
going to
not
handle that
Napoleonic
there was
wars are
insufficient
quite
funds to go to
violent.
Mars, but there was
Done.
no
World War
way
One
to do
is
so
yeah.
without breaking
significantly
the budget.
worse,
You know,
but,
I'm not
breaking the
but
net.
it's still
against
somehow
it.
localized.
So
It's
that's
not.
where
It's not the
decided to
whole.
start SpaceX,
the whole planet.
SpaceX
Like
to
And then there is something that gets
advance
released
rocket
with
technology to
nuclear
the point where
weapons
we
and
can
maybe
send
even
people
more with
to
But
thermonuclear weapons.
I am
and,
like,
and then you end up
and,
building
that
not
was
I think it'd be
dozens,
very
but,
hard
2002.
you know,
Would
thousands,
take
So that
thousands
wasn't,
of
thousands.
you
of
didn't
them in the
start
Yeah,
out
so
60s and 70s.
Renee's
wanting
point
to
that
start
the
a
apocalyptic
business,
literature
wanted to
correctly
start
which is
read
interesting
something that
because
was
like
interesting
simply
to
a
you that you
prediction
thought
of what human
humanity
beings
needed.
will
My
do
friends
to
will
each
And
other.
then
say
as
too.
you
So
start,
Suddenly
I trust
becomes
them.
like
people
to
really
Yeah.
up until
calculate on,
1945 is
But I
thought
think
that how
part
could
of
human
that is
beings
to
possibly be
prepare us
sort of the
responsible
ball
for the
sort
end
of
of the world?
unravels.
And
it turns
after
out
Hiroshima and
this is-
Nagasaki,
could be a
were
very
answers
profitable
only 2
business.
hours.
where you can
Yeah,
kind of
you have
tell
there's
I mean,
and there's
it
all
is
this sort
now,
of
but
there's liberal theologian writing in the
being monetized.
1780
Companies
I-
trying
the
to,
argument
like,
for
no
why you should
prior
read
example of
apocalyptic
really a rocket startup
literature,
succeeding.
but
and
also
because
various
occasionally you get
attempts
these
kind of, like,
millenarian movements
get
and people
you
go
to
crazy.
click
It's,
on ads.
it's worth
Failed,
reminding
so
yourselves
whatever, like,
of the
again,
madness
with
of
SpaceX,
crowds.
starting
And then the
SpaceX
secondary reason you
was
can read it
really
is
how much
to
do
the
you
for,
point of
believe
like,
that,
for
I
your
think there's like a
you'll
less
get
than
into
10%
and
chance of
that
being
was sort of the
successful.
enlightenment
Maybe 1%
optimism
for
of
you
circa
versus something that's also
17
trying to, like,
and
but
you
it-
of course
ads, I-
all
I think
these
there's like
doesn't
there's a
do
psychological
something
incredibly
so,
scary
for
ideas
example,
where the
it's
Antichrist
definitely
I think if
would
we started
kill so many
monitoring
people who would
defense
come with a
contractors because they
crematorium to
just
burn the
impede
bodies of all the
outlook
people
like the
who
stream that
killed
comes
and
back
the government
from
to sort
just
of
wants
lure
to
the
do very
evil
in
notions
conventional
exchange
people
things.
for
had.
who's
And of
paying
course,
us
So
then
there's,
after
it's either
the
coming from a
end
startup
of
or it's not
Hitler
happening.
in
I would take
1945,
that as a
So-
user. I think
this stuff
that'd be
just
like,
So
wasn't
like
so
a small
funny anymore.
chance of
And then,
success
yeah,
with
and then
emotions.
Gerard's
maybe
intuition
is
was
just
that
so-
we're never going to
yeah, so
modify that.
it's almost
SpaceX,
like
if
when a
you
knowledge
click on
becomes
that
too
in there,
real
mid-
and too
mid-
close.
2002,
going to be what we
It's
show
like
anyway.
some-
expecting to fail.
and I don't like
Like,
psychological
like,
repression or
like,
something like this,
but
but
failing.
New and
you
it's
know,
a flat
And even
making
like
you
when
want to
recruiting
sort of
people, I didn't
steer
like,
away
try
from
to,
it.
We can't bear to
like a-
look at it.
make
You
out
don't
that
want to
way.
talk about it
or
quite quite as
something.
much.
I said,
You
we're
could
probably gonna
reassure
die.
people,
Maybe they're
you
gonna
could tell
do it
people
outside
this is
the
not really
Small
what it's
chances we
about.
might not die.
And
And
of
if,
course, there are
but this
there
is
were
the
all
only
these
way you're gonna
strange
get
elements of
right,
the
but
mythical
that's
that were
the
brought
art.
in. You know,
And,
named
high,
after
and have to
all
feel
these
and then
terrible
I ended up being
gods
chief
from
really
engineer of the
ancient
rocket,
Greece, the
not
Saturn
because I
god
wanted
who ate
to,
his own
but
children,
because
and
I couldn't
you know,
hire
Zeus
anyone who
throws
was good.
down
Yeah, it's going to be
thunderbolts,
So-
and we have,
difficult
you know,
one.
None of the
I
good
fire
hope
raining
there's
down
a solution.
nuclear
I would
rockets
love to do
from
one like
heaven.
versus too
There
risky
was
There was this
or a really
strange
good
return of the mythical.
because a lot of the times I
and,
feel like I'm not
um,
making
this
the
very,
decisions.
and
you know, in
And
the
so
equation
mitigating
of
Yeah, no,
devices
genesis.
that's
fail,
good if
so
we can do it.
Developments
zoning
since since 1940.
exercise
Again,
for it.
Renee,
And,
the violence,
way,
we,
but-
we ourselves are in the
I don't know,
process
like,
of
I
a
love
but
it.
if
so
one
development since
hadn't worked,
1945. Two
I had no
quotations
money
here.
left, and
Build good
that
services.
would have
People
been
pay us for
it would
them.
have been
It's
So
so
Martin
it was a pretty
Rees,
close
in his
thing.
2003
Well, that's
book,
been a
Our
that's
Final
like I'd say the
Century,
difference in
there's
models
a
is
chapter
like
not work,
title
it would have
for
been
it.
just
I think
curtains
Google
and-
builds
The
great
nuclear
stuff.
threat
would have
would
just
be
like
overshadowed
gone
by
really
others that
hard
could be
fire.
as
It
destructive
is
and far
yeah,
less
They went from kind of like,
controllable.
and like,
Advanced
oh,
technology
are
will
good,
offer
but
new
end of the
instruments
day,
for
Google
creating
just
terror
had
and
that.
devastation.
And that's the thing that always
Instant
kind of,
universal communications will
I
amplify
using their
the
API
societal
stuff,
impact.
I'm not as too
This is
concerned,
over
although,
20 years ago.
but I do think about
Like
like, man,
2000
Disastrous
Their
accidents, for
chatbot,
instance, the
that is my
unintended
thing.
creation or
Their
release of
wizard
noxious,
names are aligned.
fast-spreading
called Summer
pathogens
2008,
are possible. I think the odds are no better than
the third launch
50-50
of SpaceX had
that we
failed.
will
A third
survive
failure in a row.
You know,
to
there
the
was
end
like
of
a
the
time
present
where
The Tesla
century.
financing round
lots
had
of ads,
failed.
but I still
Quotation
thought it
two.
was
Tesla
the best
was going
thing on the
bankrupt
internet.
fast.
I mean, I love
Revelation
search.
16:16.
So I don't like
And the
it's
demonic
really
spirits
just,
assembled the kings
it's like,
at
man,
the
this is
place
grim.
that in Hebrew is
good
called
attribute.
Armageddon.
This is
I want to
gonna
get the word
be,
Armageddon
and I
in
like
here
tale of
because you
warning.
use it. It's important in your
but
An exercise
there are
analysis.
obviously issues too.
Probably
Um,
throughout
Yeah,
that period, a lot of
the
people
Apple
were
model,
saying,
Okay,
as an Apple
so the
user,
notion
Elon is a
is
software guy.
paying a lot for my phone.
Why
Oh,
is
yeah,
he
no,
working
no,
on
it's some
hardware?
kind
We're
of
not trying
Why
to
would
do
you-
all these things in it.
cataclysmic
Yeah, why would
These
you
are
choose to
high
work on
ads,
this, right?
Not terribly
100%.
effective.
So
which
you can
probably
look at
should
the-
be.
Revelation
Which
tells
would
us
have been
that
There was
in
really
a book
good.
written some
Yeah,
2,000
so it's
years
going to be
ago.
interesting. I guess
Martin Rees's
Uh,
book is written
And
21
they
years
kept
ago.
calling me
watching and seeing
internet
this, and we
guy.
start to
And it's
think,
all
man,
entirely
ChatGPT is
plausible.
So,
really
like,
pushing this,
internet
and we
Sure.
start
guy,
looking
aka
at
and,
full.
anything.
And I think that
Attempting
there
to
is
build
there is a way
rocket
we can come back to this in describing all
So
of
we
this
had
in a much more
you know,
rationalist,
there was a model update,
non-theological
and then
way. So you can talk about
the thing that happened
existential
was the
risk.
model is trying
And
to get
it
a
does
little
sound
bit
pretty
There's
absurd.
existential
Like,
risk
literally,
of
a guy starts
nuclear
a
war.
company,
There's
doesn't
And
sound
existential
like
that
it.
brings
risk
us
of
the human AI
um,
interactions. People are
bioweapons,
using these
So I didn't
systems
hold
to
against
engineered
develop
bioweapons,
relationships
maybe
with that.
admittedly,
Like,
it does
of,
sound
how do you
palatable.
see the
AI
shine
and,
coming on what's OpenAI as a position,
killer robots
personality?
or
Unfortunately, the whole
automatic
force
autonomous
is,
weapon
um,
systems guided by AIs.
and
There
NASA
is
wanted us
Could I
there's
ask you-
existential risk around
contract to resupply
had
the
a bunch
space
of
station.
around the environment, maybe
negative
not just climate
consequences on
change,
I think
but maybe
that
there's sort of all
was
sorts of
society as
other
a whole,
dimensions
maybe
where
individual users.
there's some
Although
argument we
they
have
were
one
given
planet
the
and we
20
want to be a
seconds,
little
or
bit
it was
careful
like
and not
right
mess it
before
up totally.
Christmas.
Peter, on AI,
Because
I've
even the
never
fourth
had a
launch
chance to
wasn't enough to
put this one
succeed.
to you.
It-
I've never,
NASA
And
needed
that
to
was
don't know as
negotiate
much
a
about
big
it as you,
contract to keep us
obviously,
alive, so
but I've never
That was the
Um,
big
been aware of a technology that was
So I
so
got that
polarizing
whole-
from the
there were a
get-go.
lot of other
From,
There are
like,
things.
plenty of
the
people who
NASA
say,
NASA
calm
team
down,
and
AI is going to
stuck
lead to
on
one
you
medical
more
breakthrough
rewarding
after
you
another.
on the
We
contract
produce
to
such
keep us
abundance
space
that
station. I
we
like
don't need to
And I
worry
was
about
thinking
I love you guys. Which is
Provide for
probably
that's more.
you know, what they hear.
And then, of
that,
course, there's this other
you know, there'd be
strain
something,
that
You know,
will have
So
there was
military.
like,
Well,
man,
here,
mine
Henry
is nobody's
Kissinger. I found this
favorites.
good
And then,
quotation from a book,
But
Kissinger's last
pretty
book, which he
close
wrote
to
with
the
Eric
Tesla
Schmidt.
financing
Quote, if you
round
imagine
on
a
the
war
last
between
hour
China and the
last day
United
that it was
States, you
possible,
have
asked me
artificial
just like
intelligence
December
weapons.
24th.
Nobody has really
2008,
tested these things on a
we
broad
would've bounced
scale,
payroll 2 days after
and you
Christmas.
can't tell
Our
exactly
standard
what will
travel
happen when
is
AI
most
fighter
helpful.
planes
Those are
on
no
both sides
representative
interact.
of that's for sure.
So you are then
I
in a
guess
world
from
of
your
potentially
PayPal and Zip2
on any
experience,
given
Total
jumping
might
into
wanna
these
model
destructive.
it one way,
hardcore
but over the
hardware
course of
and your
startups.
how are we to
Yeah.
understand AI?
It
might
feels like
not
one of
match
the
up.
through lines was
Mhm.
being able to
You know,
find
Well, it's
and eventually
see it, we
attract
did
the
it.
partially
smartest
it's unknown.
possible
It
people,
can mean a
you
lot
know,
of different
people
things.
who
It's poorly defined.
What do you-
AI
what
can
would-
be
I mean,
the
the
next
people in this
generation
room,
of
like,
computers, the
some of
last
most of the
generation
people
of
here, I don't
computers,
think have even
anything in
managed a
between.
single person
Um,
yet.
You know,
They're
I
just
think the
starting
classic
their career.
definition of
What
AI
would you tell
was something
people?
that
You know,
passed the
Elon Musk
Turing
never
test
had
and
to
that
do
could
that
fool
yet
you
in
into
the long
thinking
run.
it was a human
I
being.
generally
so
think
in some
to
sense,
try to be as
you know,
useful as
had not been
possible. It
passed,
may
but
sound
was
trite,
passed by
to filter things.
ChatGPT
it's
in
so
late
hard to
22,
use,
early
especially
23.
AIs
useful
that
to a
are,
lot of people.
And so that is a that is a
I would
pretty
say the
significant
area under the
development.
curve of total
And
utility is like
does it
how
feel
much-
like
how
an
user
inflection
prices
point
do
as
for, like,
important as
things times how many
1945?
people.
Why?
It's
I
I think it's on
aside
par.
that was
Let's say in the
physics
computer
and
world, I
different
think it's on
tech
par
was
with
a
the
really
internet
difficult
in the late
thing.
They all
90s.
kind of
I think
sort
if
of
you're smart
And,
to do true
genre
work,
of image.
And then there are so many different ways it can be applied
comparisons where users
that
are
it's-
looking
Don't
in
aspire
just
to
these two
glory,
things in
aspire to
isolation.
work.
I
You know,
prefer this one
How
better.
can you
I
tell
don't
if
that are
it's
good
true?
and
assumes
that are dangerous.
Yeah.
That it's
Is it
Which
it's
I
hard to know
think
how to
is
how to
like
quite
what happens with other
Mimic
people?
weight them all
What
out.
product
I-
does for people?
If I had to
What, you know,
score the
what is that
Silicon
in a
Valley
can only imagine
debate,
where
I'm
that's
When
not
you're
I'm not
looking
on
for
the
people to
Luddite
come work
side.
for you,
So
like what, you know, what's
always
the
try
salient
to
thing that you
be
look
more
for?
building
on
these things
the
and
pro-tech
producing
side. But if I had to
always
score
that
it
sort
as
of
a
evolving
debate,
new image model comes
I
out,
do
you have
believe
sort
the
of
effective
product,
altruists
and you
are
have
winning
to
the
have
argument.
Sora
The
is
argument is
successful,
something
how you
like
sort of amount of
there are a
compute
lot
to
of
do that.
dangerous
Illustrates
corner
the
cases
big problem
with this
everybody's facing.
technology,
That's what I mean.
and
So, and then
you
to
do whatever.
address
we should be
this,
really
you know,
careful.
whether
I
you're
don't
CEO
quite know
or
how it's going
any
to
role
work.
in a startup, you do
Maybe
whatever it
maybe it
takes.
doesn't
And
become a
there's all these,
godlike
like,
intelligence,
computers,
which is
and
some
just
of
other
the
than
sort of
that, I think a lot of people are
futuristic
going
It's always be
transhumanist
and their price
smashing
tag
your
nonsense.
$500
like,
billion.
like
But,
we internalize
but
responsibility.
you know, it could
What
be
is
it could
the
just be
simple
this
description of giving
autonomous
volume
weapon
is
system
when,
on a drone
ego
I think
to
where
ratio,
we want to make them
it's
autonomous
an
because if
is
the
double
human
greater than
is in the
sine
loop,
one.
the human gets
You
jammed.
know,
So there's
like
you know,
if
there's a
ego to
logic to
ability
a lot of
ratio
these things where
gets too high, then you're
and then you know there
you're
are aspects
gonna
of it
basically
become more
break the
for
check
for strike
reality.
type weapons,
And
and there's
way
some
AI
kind of
terms,
crazy
your arrow
you know,
will
arms
have-
race
there's
between
this-
the U.S.
you'll
and
break your
communist
RL
China, and then
incredibly
how does
So
this
you wanna-
affect
you wanna
that
break
arms
your arm,
race
you wanna
and
have a strong
change?
RL,
So there are
which
sort
means
of
internalize
a lot of
responsibility and
questions
minimizing ego.
uh,
And you
like
do
that.
whatever the
I would
task is,
say,
whether-
Um,
whether it's
but
and
grand or humble.
the larger
So,
existential
thing
risk
that is-
point
I
that
mean,
I
that's kind of like
always
why
make
I prefer
is
the term
that
like
there's a way
technologies
in which
engineering
the
as
people
opposed
who are
to
worried
research.
about these
AI
existential
I
scale
risks,
prefer the term
and
delivering it.
you can
and-
also
and I
criticize
don't- I
them.
actually don't
You
want
can
to
criticize them
call
for being
XAIs
Luddites
or
and
be a
et cetera,
companies.
Just
but
how big
you
the
can also criticize them
I
for
think
not
if-
being
it's like,
apocalyptic enough
whatever the
because they're
simplest,
most of the time they're just
and so
focused on
Stargate
one.
is an
most
effort.
You know, it's like the nuclear weapons people
a
are
lot of
still
capital
just
ideally
talking about
lowest ego
nukes,
terms are
and
those are
Greta
generally a good way to go.
is, you know,
Operational
she's
expertise
it's
together.
just the
You want
climate.
as close to
She's
the
not worried
reality
about
harder.
AI, and she's not worried
Next
about
generation
nukes,
That's
and
and
I think
make
everyone in
and
this
much less
room
the
is,
COVID
really looks up to
virus that was
everything you've done
bioengineered in
around
the Wuhan lab or
mapping
something
sort of
like this.
Paragon of first
And,
principles.
one of the
And,
partners,
and then,
thinking about the
you
stuff
know,
you've done,
You know, I've often thought you should get
how
all
do you
these
actually
people who are
determine your
worried about
reality?
existential risk and
Because that
Illumina
seems like a
fight
pretty
it out
big
national social
and
media
part of it.
decide which
Other
ones
people
really
who
matter and how to
have never made
prioritize them.
anything,
And in some sense, the
non-engineers,
scary answer is there's some
sometimes
truth
journalists at
to
times
all of
who've never
them.
done
but
anything.
we
And
are-
then
Is
if
it
we
in
were
the
to do
room
that
right now?
exercise
Some-
fully,
But we will
then
deploy
clearly you
what I
have
would want to do
another
is
set
I'd
of
also
people
like to
who
throw in
are builders
one
who
more
have very
existential
high,
risk
sort
that
of
in my
area
mind
under the
is
curve,
as
who are
big
in your
as
circle.
all
Like,
these
you know,
technological risks.
how should people approach
nuclear
that? Like,
war
what has
and
worked for
I
you?
I
runaway
went
What would you
bioweapons
pass
and,
on? Like,
you know,
site
weaponized
to X,
AI
to
with
build out an
autonomous
children,
weapon
like,
systems.
you know, what do you
And
tell them?
that is
You're like,
that's the
you
risk
need to
of
make
a
your way in this world.
totalitarian one world
You know, here's how to
government.
construct a
And,
reality that is
500 billion.
And again,
predictive from
we can,
first principles.
like with all the other existential
Well,
risks, it's hard to know how to measure these things probabilistically because you know we only have one world. Once once you get a totalitarian one world government,
First
but
then
can't
principles means
see
just
one
obviously
you
just
can't
means,
reverse it.
break things down to the fundamental
and,
systematic elements that are most likely
and
to
then
be
the
true.
reason I
And
like to
reason
throw
up from there as cogent
that
as
risk
possible.
in
As
is
opposed
that it seems
reasoning
to
by
me
analysis or metaphor.
that the implicit solution to
And
existential
then you
risks
just simple things like
all
thinking
the
in
other
limit,
sorts
like if you
is to lean in
extrapolate,
to
minimize
to a sort of
maximize that
very
is
non-democratic,
very
There's a great
one world
I
state
use all the tools
that
of
will
physics.
that will
they're
highly
applied to
regulate
wood
and
graphite
stop these
pencil.
technologies.
I
And,
know.
So it's like a superpower.
you know,
actually.
if Greta
And-
gets everyone on the
and
planet
so
to
you can
ride a
take, like,
bicycle,
take, for example,
maybe
like
that's a way to
rockets.
solve
How
climate
much
change.
should a rocket-
But
a rocket
it has
cost?
sort of this quality of going
the
from a
world
frying
Technical
pan
approach
into
to
the
how-
fire.
do
to-
these things
that
and
you would take how much
standing
rocket should
inside
cost.
of
They're-
Again, if I
they're
understand your
historically,
argument,
the
this
cost
is
of rockets are
already
I
high.
was really just
And
thinking
assume
about
that
the
clear
your
in the
rocket
way
cost
we
will be
lead our
somewhat similar
lives
to the prior
that
cost
it
of
took
rockets.
in this
to get
First
slowing
principles
of
approach would be you look at the
progress.
materials
Now,
when you
rocket
get
is
your phone
comprised
out,
of.
this it
So
seems to me
that's
is worth
aluminum,
dwelling on because
copper,
it
carbon
shows
fiber,
answer back.
you
it shows that the
whatever
fear
case
is
may be.
real and
And
has
At this
say
point, you
what-
probably don't even think
genuine
that's
effects in
how
the way
much
we
does
all
that
lead our
rocket weigh,
lives.
and what are
But
the
we have to spend a
constituent
moment to
elements, how much
define
do they
it.
weigh?
So,
That is
What is
really
the
amazing.
if I may,
material price
let me
per
start with a
kilogram of
quotation
this
from you.
constituent
There
element?
has
And
been
that sets
the
the
last
actual
a
thousand
narrow cone of
on what a
progress
rocket
many hundreds
around
of years.
computers, the internet,
It's
and maybe now
asymptotically
artificial
approached the cost of the
intelligence.
raw materials.
But
working incredibly
if
hard.
tech
And
means
then you realize,
producing
oh,
more with
actually,
less,
a rocket-
scientific
then we should be
materials of a
seeing
rocket are
dramatic
and then
only
economic
maybe 1 or
progress.
2%
We don't.
of-
And
The
of
millennials are not
historical
dramatically
cost of
better
rockets.
off
So
than their boomer
the
parents.
manufacturing must
Close
necessarily
the
be
world.
very inefficient.
Okay,
that had
so
to
you
happen
mentioned it
to
a
get
moment ago.
this
But return to this
raw
notion
material
of
cost is only 1 or 2%.
slowing
First
technical
analysis
think about
of
all the stuff that we
progress,
potential for,
that, you know,
this
for
great
cost optimization
disappointment
and
by
trace them all the way
contrast,
back
what we
before you
see
get to
around
people
us
that were
today,
just
what
like
we
digging
feel
in.
around
Let's
us
give
today
an
by
AI sort of
contrast with a
AI
century or
example,
so
I
ago.
guess.
or even late
Last year we went
60s.
for
Yes,
XGI,
yes,
we were
okay.
trying
Jetson's,
to
you know,
types
build,
Star Trek,
uh,
the sort of
a
optimistic
training
science
set
fiction of the
I
cluster.
50s and 60s
We-
where
behind the
we went
scenes
yeah,
to
we'd have
various
flying
about
cars,
to ask
you know, you
development
have
of Project Stargate,
supersonic
and
aviation
partnerships,
everywhere,
particularly
and we needed
UAE,
100
all sorts of
Elon Musk
cures
had
for
tried to
diseases,
derail that.
and yes, there was an
And,
incredible amount of progress
What
in this
have
world.
you
Was there
seen?
estimates
What have you
much
heard?
less
how long it
in the
would
world
take
of
to complete
atoms.
What's
that
the
I always
take on
think
that?
24
I
months.
had
a lot of
said
It's like, well, we
what
need
we
to get
do
that
is
done in
embedded
6 months.
I think
in this physical world
So
of atoms, and
then
so when that slows, that's
Or we won't be competitive.
that's definitely felt as quite
If you break that
staggering.
down, what do you think?
The question I always then get at, and then you get into endless debates: is this true, or is there still a lot of progress? How we want to measure it? I tend to measure it in things like these economic terms, and the way that the average millennial is having a tougher time than their boomer parents at the same point in life, and so at least there's something. Even if we're not completely stuck, it's in some sense not really moving as fast as it used to. And then there's always the question of why this is, and why questions are overdetermined. As a libertarian, I would like to say it's too regulated. The FDA regulates the drugs too much. If you regulated drugs, if you regulated video games like the FDA regulates, drugs would still all just be playing Pong. And so there's a libertarian anti-regulatory thing. There is a argument that the schools aren't teaching people to be scientists. Some of the educational institutions are broken. There's an anti-liberal argument.
Some truth in all of this.
There is a Tyler Cohen argument that somehow the low-hanging fruit was picked. It was much easy discoveries to make, and now it's nature's cupboard is kind of bare, and you have to reach really hard to make an honest discovery. And maybe that's true, maybe that's just sort of a self-serving excuse of baby boomers didn't do as much as the generations that came before. But it is very striking. One way to quantify this, even if you say the rate of progress in broad fields isn't the same as it was 100 years ago. Not that it's low, even if you say it's the same. If you think of PhDs, there are probably 100 times as many PhDs today as there were in, say, 1924. And so it's the same rate of progress, and the average PhD is 99% less productive than people were 100 years ago. And that doesn't seem like a very healthy scientific ecosystem. So there's some sense that maybe it's slow, but the overarching explanation that I've come to think is a very important one is just this idea that in some way science and technology were this trap that humanity was building for itself. That there were these apocalyptic risks, and maybe going very slow was better than racing towards Armageddon.
But if you exchange energy for
so we are. I was born in 1967. I always often express frustration
and just like ship the output.
Stuck in these office buildings or houses that are decades old. All these parts of our society feel lame, slow changing, low energy, low testosterone. Nothing is going on. And then I do wonder if we were in a Jetsons type world, we might not even be sitting here to talk about it. It might have self-destructed by that. If you had a JFK as president on amphetamines going mano a mano with Khrushchev, it worked. In 1962, would it have worked every time?
So, by the way, someplace I don't make a note of this, but someplace I saw you say that Facebook had 10 years of good press. In other words, 10 years of optimism before the project sort of curdled in the public mind, and that AI went from good to bad in about a month. It's the loss of optimism. So,
you can't just order a whole bunch.
I have a quotation here. There are many explanations for this deceleration of tech. This is you, but the explanation, I believe, tech got scary. We're leery of it now. We're not embracing it in the way we used to. Add to that the notion that, again, this is, I'm thinking this through, but I'm putting it to you this question. This isn't the way things were supposed to be when the Cold War ended.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Russia was supposed to work. There was democracy and free markets, and instead we have this crazy man Putin invading Ukraine. By now there should have been at least some kind of rudimentary peace in the Mideast. Perhaps the most striking contradiction of what we expected was that by now China was supposed to be democratic. It was supposed to follow the pattern of South Korea and Taiwan, where first you have economic growth, and economic growth creates expectations, including expectations of freedom, free speech, and so forth, and these countries become democratic. China was supposed to follow that. Things are not going the way they were supposed to. Add to that our own sense of polarization in this country. This country somehow, and there's just a lot of a feeling of it's subjective. It's very difficult to get at, but it feels to me as though there's a lot of free-floating dread,
and it's hard to articulate. For example, I'll give one example, and you can think about this what you will, but a lot of my conservative friends are very critical of Fauci and all the lockdowns and masks and social distancing and the vaccine that didn't really work. And on the surface level, these critiques are, I think, quite legitimate. It was not the correct protocol for some kind of flu. It was, however, roughly the right protocol if you thought it was a bioweapon. And if you think it's a very dangerous, humanly engineered bioweapon, those are roughly all the kinds of things that you might do. And so the kind of critique I have of Fauci is that, that's what he was scared of, I think. That's why Steele met him, gives him the benefit of the doubt. And then the real critique is that you weren't supposed to infantilize our population and not talk about it. And that's what he was scared about. He was so scared about it, he didn't really talk about it. And there probably are a lot of things like this where, there is this pretty inchoate fear, but we're so scared we can't even talk about it.
There's one more concept we need to flesh out, a term that you use.
I mean, I guess, part of what I've been...
We'll put all the pieces of this together, although that may happen in the second part of our conversation, and that is the catacomb. The term comes from the Greek for he or that which restrains.
So we have all these tools.
We'll come to a moment in your analysis of the catacomb through history. But first, again, the concept itself. St. Paul, in his letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 2, verses 6 to 7, and now you know what is restraining. Again,
is it on you right now?
No. And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who restrains the catacomb. He who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. Close quote. Now that's a very enigmatic passage. The church has never defined the term. The church fathers, the early writers and thinkers in the church, wrote about it, but tended to add that their views were speculative. So we don't have any thoroughly worked out theology of the catacomb, but we do have 2,000 years ago in St. Paul a notion of some force holding back chaos, holding back evil, holding back some force that's restraining. We get to Cardinal Newman, writing in the 19th century. Cardinal Newman is a great thinker and theologian. In my judgment, the best prose stylist of the whole century in English. Cardinal Newman writes, we know from prophecy that the present framework of society and government is that which withholdeth, again, the catacomb. So he identifies it with a framework of society and government. All right. That's my little effort to present the concept of the catacomb. You use that concept how? You identify the catacomb through history.
How you use it.
Yeah, it's as you said, it's a rather mysterious concept. You can identify it with the good aspects of the Roman Empire, certain political aspects of the Roman Catholic Church, individuals, institutions that somehow are trying to hold this runaway chaos in check. I don't think it's purely reactionary. Metternich, post-Napoleon, is sort of catacombic and is also modernizing. It is a thing of history. And so there are ways to do it that
and
maybe
the resupply ships from Earth
you know,
stop
you can
coming.
good for a
one
time,
and that
but
use
that will not
everywhere, but also
necessarily
greatly
work
increases
for all
the
There's
probable
something
times.
that
And then, but I would always maybe
without
go back to,
consciousness,
you know,
intelligence,
the
both biological
apocalyptic
and
specter
digital.
use AirPods.
would be, you
That
know,
doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
Antichrist
So that's why I
or
think it's
Armageddon.
important to become a multi-planet
And,
species. And I'm somewhat
but the
troubled by the
general
Bermuda paradox. Like,
you
why
know,
have we
I
not
agree is
seen
I,
any
I,
aliens?
I think there is
Falls
there
in.
is
And
a
it could be
lot in
because
So,
this
intelligence
runaway
is
science
incredibly
technology
next
that's
year.
pushing
and
us towards
All right.
It will be
something
worth the
like
wait.
Armageddon,
It's gonna be a while.
Okay.
and then
in which
Excited.
case,
and then there
Some
is
thoughts.
you know
the
the
If you're
intelligence
the
of
natural
consciousness
giving
is
advice
pushback
to a
on
tiny
tiny
this
candle in a
five-year-old
vast
right now,
darkness.
is
The
we will
obvious
avoid
tactical stuff is
Armageddon
probably what
Do
you
everything
expect.
by
possible so the tiny
by
candle is
having a
candle just
one
goes
world
out.
It's
state
funny how
Being a
creative
multi-planet
that has
species,
real teeth, real
beyond
power,
consciousness,
and
multi-planetary,
the biblical term for that is the
greatly
Antichrist.
increase the probable
Mm.
life
And,
events
It
of
doesn't matter.
civilization.
Learn to use
you know,
AI.
And
the-
I wonder what will
it's
be
the
next.
next
though.
step
the
Of course,
before
Christian
going
intuition
to
I
other
have
star
is-
systems.
you know,
But,
I don't want
Once
that's
you at least have two
Antichrist, I don't
planets,
want
then you've got a
Armageddon.
forcing
And then
function
I would
for
like to
the
find
broader
some
space
narrow
travel.
path between
and,
between these
I
two
believe
And that
where we
ultimately
can avoid
is what
both,
will
and
lead
that's
to
and then
resilience,
and then
consciousness
certainly
expanding to the stars.
adaptability.
there are ways
the
that
Fermi
figuring out
you
paradox
defer it if you
dictates
can.
once you get
I
to
think
some
these are
try
level
to
of
do
technology,
new things.
you
I don't think it's a
yourself.
purely
How do we
reactionary
free
Yeah,
thing.
ourselves? How do we
It's
actually?
not a pure,
What would you
a pure
prescribe
Benedictine
to-
option where
I mean,
those
a
are the
room
kinds
where
full
you
of
just
engineers. Like,
retreat
what
into
can
a
we do
monastery
to
or
prevent
something
that
like
from
that.
happening?
I think that's the most
Yeah, how do we
acceleration
avoid the
thing
great
possible.
filters?
Same thing for 45.
One of the great
That-
filters would
that-
obviously be
that-
global
that-
thermonuclear war.
that's-
You quit
that's-
resisting.
Yeah, probably.
You quit. It sort of
Whenever
clears
we
the
have
field.
a
It's like the
personal
Lord
definition
Acton
of
line.
AI.
All that is
I guess
necessary
the
for
more
evil to
people
triumph
building
is the good men
benign
do
AI
nothing. So this is where
robots that-
I'm
AI
always.
that loves humanity
it can
and-
be the Benedictine
Yeah, I
option.
see a
can
lot
be
of online
good
people
for
like,
personal
they're so good.
sanctification.
Why are they
But
hiring
to the
people?
extent
robots
we're
that
talking
are
about
not
society,
can't do
Our
everything.
Our
about
friend
society.
Rod Dreher wrote a
slight
book about
design
this.
that I
The
think
idea
is,
of going to the
important is
the
extremely
idea is that
important
Christians
in
simply
building
drop
AI
out.
is
Society
there's
is
more
is
people,
going in the
very
wrong
rigorous
direction,
adherence
and
to
Christians
truth,
simply
even
drop
if
out.
that
That's
truth
roughly
is
what it is.
politically
And
incorrect.
I cannot. I don't want to argue with
My
him
intuition
on
for
the level of personal
could make AI
sanctification
very
of people
dangerous
saving their souls.
is if
My political,
force AI to
social
believe things that are
intuition
not true.
is that it's the
How
height
do
of
you think about,
irresponsibility
there's sort of this
because
argument for
that
open,
is just
open for safety
in
versus
effect hitting the
closed for
accelerator
competitive edge.
towards
I mean,
the
I think the
Antichrist
great thing is
Armageddon.
you have a
Okay,
competitive
let's finish
model.
this
Many other
first
people
part of
also
our
have competitive
conversation
models, and in that sense,
more on the
we're sort of off
Antichrist.
of maybe the worst
Let me take a
timeline
moment to
that
set
I'd be
this up,
worried
if I
about
may.
is, there's fast takeoff and it's only
A
in
few
one person's
passages from
hands.
Scripture.
That
Daniel chapter 7.
might, sort of
In the
collapse,
first year of Belshazzar,
a
king
lot
of
things,
Babylon,
whereas
Daniel had a dream.
now we have choice, which is great.
There
How
before
do
me
you
was
think
a
about
beast,
this?
fearful,
I do think there will
terrifying,
be
very strong. It
several
had great iron teeth,
deep
and it
intelligences,
ate its victims,
maybe at least
and
5.
trampled their remains underfoot.
Um,
2 Thessalonians
maybe
chapter
as much
2, we're
as
back to
10.
St. Paul. He's writing
Uh,
about the end times. It cannot happen until
I'm
there
not
has
sure that there's gonna
appeared
be
the
hundreds,
wicked
but it's
one, the
probably close.
lost
Like,
one,
maybe
the
there'll be, like,
enemy
10
who
or
raises
something like
himself
that.
above every object of worship
Of which
and flaunts the claim
maybe 4 will
that
be
he
in
is
the
God.
US.
Revelation chapter 13. Then I saw a beast
So-
emerge from the sea, and they prostrated
I don't think it's
themselves in
going
front
to
of
be
the
any
beast,
one
saying,
AI that
"Who can
has a
compare with the
runaway
beast? Who can fight
capability.
against it?" And all the people of the world will worship it.
But
Close
yeah, several deep
quote.
intelligences.
There are
What will
people who
these,
take all of
deep-
this
deep
seriously. We've
intelligences
already
actually be
quoted
doing?
René Girard.
Will it
We've
be
already
scientific
quoted
research or trying to
Cardinal
hack
Newman.
each other?
But
Probably
Daniel
all of
dates
the
from the
above.
Iron Age. Thessalonians and Revelation are 2,000
I mean,
years
hopefully
old.
they will discover new physics,
Contemporary
and I think they'll
society, we sit
very-
here in Stanford University,
they're
contemporary
definitely going to
society
invent new technologies.
all but ignores these texts or
Like I think we're quite close
derides
to
them
digital superintelligence.
as of interest only
I
to
mean, it may happen
snake handlers, as I
this
mentioned,
year.
snake
If it
handlers
doesn't happen
in
this year,
Kentucky
next
hollers.
year for sure.
You are no snake
Digital
handler.
superintelligence
You
defined
take
as
this stuff,
Not that I'm aware of.
smarter
No.
than
not that
any
you're
human
aware
at
of,
any
not that I'm aware of.
Well, so how do
So
we direct that
we'll
to sort of
come to
superabundance?
how
You
the
know,
Antichrist
we
might
could
arise,
have
what we must do to
robotic
people. We'll come to that in our
labor, you have
second
cheap
conversation.
energy,
But the first thing I want to
intelligence on
establish is,
demand.
why do
is
you
that
take
sort of the
this
white pill?
seriously?
Like, where
Well,
do you sit on
well,
the
again,
spectrum? Are there
one can take
tangible
it
things
seriously without taking it completely literally. But just let me maybe defend Daniel and the Old Testament prophet.
I think it most likely
if you
will
contrast it with, let's say,
good
a
outcome.
Greco-Roman understanding
I guess
of
I'd
history.
sort of agree with
Thucydides,
Jeff Hinton that maybe it's
Herodotus.
a 10 to
Thucydides
20%
writes
chance
the
of annihilation.
account of the,
But look on the bright side, that's
the
80 to
Peloponnesian Wars
90%
between
probability of a
Athens and
great
Sparta.
outcome.
And it has a timeless and eternal
So-
character. It's the rising power against the existing power.
Athens, the rising power, and the Thucydides trap is when this repeats itself with Wilhelmina Germany against Britain in 1914, or perhaps today China against the U.S. It's timeless and eternal. The particulars don't matter. The speeches people give don't matter. Thucydides makes them up, and it's sort of like a natural, cyclical kind of a view of history, or one where there is no specific history. And then, by contrast, I do not think it's an exaggeration to say something like Daniel was the first historian, where it is the things that matter are one time and world historical, and there was a creation, there was a fall, there's a Mosaic revelation. It's going somewhere, and the choices people make matter, and some of the choices matter in a very, very big way, and this way that Christ's ministry and death and resurrection was a part of history, or a hinge moment of history, and then there are ways it continues, and I think that's sort of a feel for history. And something like Hegel is just a pale shadow of the Judeo-Christian sense of history. You could say, again, you have to qualify this very carefully, but you could say that the New Testament God is the first progressive, because the new supersedes the old. And so it's the first time that there is something new just by virtue of being new. There's something new that comes in through history. You have to, in all these ways, you have to qualify it. If you go too progressive, you get to something like, Marcion or Marx. If you're, but if you say it's all in the Old Testament, that's somehow not quite right either.
I think in the next 6 to 12 months, we'll be doing our
So you take it seriously because you don't believe history is Groundhog Day. It doesn't happen over and over and over again. The cyclical aspect, the eternal recurrence, in some fundamental way, the meaninglessness of it. History is going someplace, and if it's going someplace, that means there will be an end point. And there are important things that will happen that are different from things that happened in the past, and so to have
wavelengths.
And so if we want to have a feel for our times, for what is going on in the world in
at some point,
the early 21st century,
would not simply be correcting
there are ways we can try to reference it to the past. You could say, there's some parallel between the decline of the United States and the fall of the Roman Empire.
And bandwidth
but the differences are surely really important. It's happening in the world of nuclear weapons and instantaneous communication, and
digital superintelligence before that.
It's happening in a very post-Christian, hyper-Christian world, not in a pagan world. And somehow the classical approaches to history always downplay the things that are one-time, unique, world historical. And
sort of simultaneous to that,
I think we should take our bearings more
the
from
rocks can talk and reason.
Peter Thiel,
there may be 130 IQ now.
Join us for part 2. This is a sentence I never thought I'd utter. Join us for part 2.
How do you reconcile those two things? Like what's going to happen in 5, 10
years? For Uncommon Knowledge,
what
the Hoover Institution, and Fox Nation. I'm Peter Robinson.
That, they're the ones who are creating instead of maybe below the API line.
Well, they call it the singularity for a reason. You don't know what's going to happen. In the not that far future, the percentage of intelligence that is human will be quite small. At some point, the collective sum of human intelligence will be less than 1% of all intelligence. And if things get to Kardashev level 2, we're talking about human intelligence, even assuming a significant increase in human population and intelligence augmentation, like massive intelligence augmentation, where like everyone has an IQ of 1,000 type of thing. Even in that circumstance, collective human intelligence will be probably 1/billionth that of digital intelligence. Anyway, we're the biological bootloader for digital superintelligence.
I guess just to end off.
Was I a good bootloader?
Where do we go? How do we go from here? I mean, all of this is pretty wild sci-fi stuff that also could be built by the people in this room. If you do you have a closing thought for the smartest technical people of this generation right now? What should they be doing? What should they be working on? What should they be thinking about, tonight as they go to dinner?
Well, as I started off with, I think if you're doing something useful, that's great. If you just try to be as useful as possible to your fellow human beings, and that then you're doing something good. I keep harping on this, like, focus on super truthful AI. That's the most important thing for AI safety. Obviously, if anyone's interested in working at XAI, please let us know. We're aiming to make Grok the maximally truth-seeking AI, and I think that's a very important thing. Hopefully, we can understand the nature of the universe. That's really, I guess, what AI can hopefully tell us. Maybe AI can maybe tell us where are the aliens, and what, how did the universe really start? How will it end? What are the questions that we don't know that we should ask? And are we in a simulation? Or what level of simulation are we in?
Well, I think we're going to find out.
Am I an NPC?
Elon, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, please give it up for Elon Musk.
Thanks,